Hello again. I'm just reading a long piece in the New Yorker from a few weeks ago about attention and attention spans and the study of attention, and people worrying that younger generations, because of iPhones and all the rest of it, have shorter attention spans. And there's lots of figures to back that up, to do with how long advertising says we will look at things, people will look at things for, and how long concentration lasts. And then more interesting stuff about the nature of attention and how people are more used to navigating streams of different kinds of information coming in. And maybe that's a more sophisticated way of attending to things. And then there's all this stuff about birding, this kind of society of academics who get together and look at paintings and respond to them slowly, and gather like flash mobs, like professorial flash mobs, to appreciate art mostly and then write about it, which seems like a slightly artificial way of doing things, but that's academics for you, isn't it? I've just noticed, oddly enough, my copy of the first Ladybird book of British birds talk about birding. I forget why they call the business of paying attention birding. It's an old classical illusion, I think, to do with watching the birds. And oddly enough, I just saw somebody talking about Amy Tan's book about bird watching and how it was her response to a shitty world, basically, that she got fed up with fake news and disinformation and trivia of everyday life, and decided to paint the birds in her garden, which seems like a sensible thing to do. But I do think about attention all the time, and doing this YouTube video thing that I've been doing for the last 4 months is interesting because people have told me that I do it wrong in a nice way, that I do it differently. I do realize I don't say, "I'm so excited" all the time, which is what you have to say on YouTube book videos. Everyone says they're excited. I don't believe they can be that excited all the time. I've noticed that a lot of these videos are about getting through books and finishing them or amassing them and talking about amassing them, talking about being excited about reading them and diving into them. And then there's lots of stuff about unhauling and getting rid of ones you haven't read yet that you'll never read. There's a lot of coming and going of books, and not so much about actually reading them. Sometimes there's some really lovely ones that do talk about reading and their responses to books. A lot of things are very hectic, though, and very fast and gabbly. And I guess I do that differently as well. I suppose mine are slower, and they're not edited either, which means you get 25 minutes or something of me blethering on and taking my time. But that's just the way I prefer to do it. I think if I'm talking about reading, it is about the process of spending lots of time doing stuff. It is a crazy thing to do if I think about it. This week I've read a science fiction novel, a new science fiction novel, and I've given a lot of time to it. It's 500 pages long, and I think I read about 30 pages an hour when I'm really concentrating on reading and letting nothing else in. That's exactly the speed of audiobooks, I believe. It's about 10,000 words. It's an hour read aloud by a kind of a good audiobook reader. That's inside my head, so I hear things at the speed of everyday life, which suits me. And after a long time, trying all sorts of ways of reading, it always comes back to that. I have to hear the whole thing inside my head in real time. And so this week has been a long time with this novel by Emie Jikimie-Pearson. Staying up late, reading all through the evening, actually, getting right away from the telly and everybody else and giving all those evening hours to a novel, which feels really luxurious, actually. It's not often that you can turn whole days over to reading. Even as a freelancer, there's stuff I have to be doing that takes me away from books. I do realize that all the kind of trades and bargains and negotiations I make in my life to do with time are always about making time to read. That is always the thing. I'm greedily storing time up. And it's awful, but if I make plans, this is like a cartoon I saw once. If I make plans that I'm really, wanting to do, seeing people and going to something, I'm kind of almost pleased when they fall through or the weather's bad or something doesn't happen, because I just know I can spend that time reading instead. And it feels like such a betrayal of your friends. I saw somebody doing with a cartoon of that recently, and I really chimed with it. It goes back to all sorts of things in my childhood. I can remember a couple of stories in particular. The one about starting infant school and being shown to the library at the back of the class while the rest of the children had their register done. And I sat reading a picture book. And then after about 10 minutes was invited to join the rest of the class. And I was so disappointed because I thought school was going to be me reading separately at the back, and it wasn't. It was only the very first 10 minutes. And things like reading in my father's car on trips up and down the motorway when he'd try and kind of interrogate me. As a policeman, his skills were in interrogation, and he'd interrogate his own children. And I would sit reading, and I remember very particularly having my own first copy of Alice in Wonderland and losing myself utterly in that while he went on and on from the driver's seat. So, I mean, it's reading as an escape, isn't it? But it's about having that experience of giving your whole attention to something without qualms and knowing that you can. I suppose as a reader, you take that for granted. Another interesting thing they said in the article was about the vogue for mindfulness, which is, something I've mocked in my cartoon book, Panda, because in some ways it seems kind of slightly sentimental and callow. In the article, they talk about mindfulness being a very selfish thing, that actually it's about people just tending to their own self-care, which it is. But attentiveness, attention, is something else. That means reaching out of yourself and listening to somebody, either on the page or a real person in front of you. And that to me is interesting, that reading is an act of attending to somebody. It's not a selfish act. It's an attempt to connect. Back in the old E.M. Forster thing, only connect. I did say a few weeks ago that everything goes back to E.M. Forster for me, and maybe it really does. Anyway, this is me blethering on. The science fiction novel, hang on, that I was talking about is here. The Principle of Moments, Emie Jikimie-Pearson. And I finished it very late last night. My hair is ludicrous, I'm sorry. And it was just a stunning conclusion, really. The climax to the book, the kind of adventure part of it, happens maybe 50 pages from the end, and the rest is settling down and final meetings between people and setting up the next book. There's something magical about this, I think, this particular book. I've read lots of books that do similar tropes and some similar ideas. But with this, the characters really leap off the page. You care what happens to them. There's a scene where they're all together and It's the last time the principal characters are together, and a planet is being destroyed around them, and there are minutes, seconds for them to escape. And you really can't see how they're going to do it. And I suppose it's a Deus Ex Machina that gets plucked out of the air to save them. But that doesn't matter so much. You're still kind of reading against the time. You're still kind of reading against the clock and hoping they get out of it. And you know they're going to get out of it because there's 100 pages of the book left. There has to be. And you know they're going to be the heroes. These three characters at the heart of it are the reincarnations of heroes from the past, from the kind of epic legends of the past of this series. So that's nice as well. It's a bit like, I don't know, it's a bit like what Doctor Who's been pointing to in recent years with the timeless child, the Doctor realising that she had been somebody in a life previous to the one that she knows. To me, as I said before, is a very Michael Moorcock idea, the eternal champion, that the heroes in any given story are just reincarnations of earlier heroes. And sometimes they remember those lives. And I love Doctor Who being included in that. But she seems to be kind of very self-consciously treading on that kind of mythology. I'm sure it comes from actual mythology, whichever one she's concerned with. It seems like a kind of Buddhist idea, doesn't it? Doctor Who also did it in the 90s for the first time with the Cartmel master plan. And the Sylvester McCoy Doctor realising that he'd been a contemporary of Omega and Rassilon, these figures from dark, dim days of legend, his memories returning of having been somebody else. I love that, the idea that we have heroes with this shadowy sense of having lived previous lives. It's almost a kind of metafiction, isn't it? That they are aware of their fictional precursors, almost. That kind of interests me. Anyway, I really love this, and it ends so romantically with a reunion. I wanted to read some of the kind of later pages and later scenes on one of these videos, and I thought, oh, maybe those would be spoilers. They'd be considered spoilers, so I won't do that. But I will recommend that everybody reads it. Everybody reads it. Now, I think if you're fond of a certain kind of space opera and you love Star Wars and Doctor Who, basically, just like the blurb said, I think if you like the kind of more sophisticated versions of those shows, if you love, for example, the Doctor Who novels of the 90s, where we live in this slightly dingy but epic universe, where life is quite ramshackle and older gods are massing against the Doctor and his companions, but the Doctor's a kind of Machiavellian sprite. Those kind of figures are in this. There's a older, seemingly a enemy at the beginning who turns out to be a kind of slightly benevolent archivist by the end of it. That's very like those 90s Doctor Who books. And maybe they're just tropes from the wider world of science fiction. I don't know. And if you like the more sophisticated versions of Star Wars, like Andor, where people are at the mercy of great cosmic shifts and politics and are flung into this world of hopping from planet to spaceship to space station, having to pick up items and clues and people who can help them. There's even a planet-destroying weapon at one point in this that the evil emperor wields. So there's lots of things to recognize, but it's in a very kind of a modern framing, I'd say. It feels, as I said before, quite fresh. And I guess it's because it's all that post-colonial stuff. This is talking about galactic empires, but with those links back to the Georgian era where there's quite explicit talk of slavery. And an amazing scene where the crown jewels are melted away and a slave from Africa where the diamonds were mined talks about slavery and what the empire owes his people. So it's a very self-consciously race-aware kind of science fiction. And that's very interesting as well when you think about the tropes of science fiction often being about empire and slaves and invasion and defeat. Well, you know, black writers have got a lot to say about that stuff. So I'm very interested to follow the rest of this trilogy, and I was glad to see the next one comes out early next year. Anyway, that's that. And now I'm on to finish Love of the Seven Dolls. One of the reasons that this might have fallen out of print, I realise, is because of, I guess, a kind of racist portrayal of one of the lead characters. There's a kind of black African slave character who is slightly caricatured, and there's words and language that would have to be looked at, I guess, if this came back into print. It's a very 1950s artifact, of course. He's a very sympathetic character, but that doesn't stop the trappings of the storytelling belonging to a different age and one that would be difficult nowadays. But there's always stuff they can do to refocus language. As we saw with the Roald Dahl conversations last year about how much or how little you can change texts which people consider classics to fit in with contemporary tastes and prohibitions. Right, I'm going to read. That's what I'm going to do. I've been thinking about an awful lot of stuff. I was rereading journals from last year and realising how depressed about everything I was this time last year after a number of horrible setbacks in my writing career. And maybe it's a mistake to go back and reread journals. I was doing it for a piece I was writing, and it was a shock to see what kind of a state I was in. I don't think anybody kind of realised. I kept it quite to myself, really. But it was a tough time. I think this year I'm probably a bit better off, and that's not least in part to having you to talk to. So I hope you're listening and paying attention. Yeah, I think actually having this chatty YouTube channel has been a big help for me. Not that I want to start talking about, self-help and all the rest of it. Anyway, I'm going to go. I haven't even talked about the science fiction and the romantasy that I've been considering launching into reading. I saw a really interesting thing about Gallant's science fiction masterworks classics yesterday, which has made me want to read science fiction classics that I've just missed out on. Things that I thought I'd read, things that I thought I knew, and then realising, no. It's always the way, isn't it, with books? Always the way with every single genre. You think you've covered something, you think you know about something, then you go and look and you realise you've read so little. And to me, that used to be frustrating. Now I just find it delightful. There's so much more to read. Anyway, I'm going to go. Goodbye, and I'll see you again soon in the next episode.